So it'll be a change from the kind of session that you've had before. They're planning to do breakout groups and really try to engage with you as the audience, as opposed to, you just hearing from the people at the front. So I think this is going to be a very exciting session. We have two people, Glenn and Rick from the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, and they're going to be the one driving this. And what they're really trying to do is use the knowledge at this meeting to develop different solutions to different problems, focused on two problems that are quite different. One is on development financing, and the other is on minerals. And so I'll let them take it from here.
Thanks a lot. My name is Rick Ziegler, and I am with the U.S. government's Environmental Protection Agency. It's true, we do have two pretty disparate topics that we're going to go over, and then we're going to break out into some smaller groups depending on how many people we have. People online, I understand there's a couple people online, and they will be able to engage too. We'll figure out how to do that best we can. The session will include a short presentation by both Glenn and myself, and then at the end of that presentation, we're going to do what you've probably done in the past in sessions, that have breakout groups. We're going to gauge interest in a couple different topics, and then maybe just form a couple of pods in the room to talk them through and look for ideas. So without further ado, I'll sort of go through the slideshow, which will take about maybe 15 minutes. Again, then we'll have the breakout groups. And then we'll reconvene at the end of that to have sort of like what people talked about and what they thought, how we might advance these solutions to the problems we're going to introduce. So first, we're going to introduce these so-called challenges. So Glenn and I work in EPA's international office and in the Office of Global Affairs and Policy. And in our sort of day-to-day work, we've come across maybe I would say multiple projects that we thought the folks from this Eye on Earth community and maybe even the World Data Forum would be able to sort of help us with solutions, to formulate solutions. Maybe they're information technology or data solutions. We think they're ripe for these solutions. So you're about to see a few problems that we see every day, and we think there's this tangible way to solve the problems. So I'm going to go over the subject I'm least familiar with because that's how we drew the straws and that's how it worked out. So one of our colleagues could not make it, but who is a gold supply chain expert. And so the first of the four challenges is on tracking and tracing the gold supply chain. So you might be familiar with images like this. Artisanal and small scale gold mining is happening throughout often the southern hemisphere, and so it's often happening in sort of an ad hoc way. And there's a few environmental problems with this, and we're not going to get into the details of this because many of you could probably guess what they are. You're scarring the landscape. It's sort of happening in an informal way. And in the photos now on the screen, what you're seeing is that often the small scale miners work with mercury. You'll also see some cyanide techniques that might be a little bit of a larger scale, but still medium, small, it can happen. But what you're seeing here is mercury. The mercury is used to sort of bind to the gold, and then you can burn it off. And it's not just, of course, risks to wildlife and to habitat, but also to human health. You have people, using their hands to do this. And when they're done, they might recollect the mercury. Hopefully there's some gold there, I guess. But then you sort of take it out of the river. Maybe you lose some, maybe you don't, and then you'll move to the next place. So there's a lot of different actors in the gold supply chain, and our thought here is that if we could somehow trace, maybe in a way similar to blockchain transactions, which I'll get to in a second, or just trace each transaction, we might have a way of sort of illuminating where there are problems. We don't know how to do this. So at the far left of the screen, you see the miners, and you have people sort of like the kind of the local people in the rural areas who are a bit sort of entrenched in this, you might say. Not many resources. And then what happens is you might have that little at the end of the day, you might have a pretty expensive ball of kind of, mercury and gold that you might then hand off to a smaller trader or dealer. Eventually this goes up to a refiner, and eventually it goes to to us, because it's beautiful. Gold is beautiful. We happen to know that when people are buying gold, they're willing to pay extra if they know that that its history was maybe better than what it could be. Most of us are, I think, and I think it's just one of those things you want to try to do it right. So we know there's a market for this, but right now we just can't trace it. When it comes to small scale gold mining, we cannot trace interaction to interaction. So you've probably heard of this concept of blockchain, which is described in the bottom diagram. And I'm not going to get into the technical details of this, but the idea being is that if you have multiple actors sort of tracking an interaction and all cataloging that interaction together, then if someone comes along and says, no, the interaction was different than what you thought, you might have 30 or 40 people in sort of the blockchain who can say, nope, the recollection was like this. We happen to know that at such and such a point in time, this transaction happened for this much money from across these two entities. And then you have multiple entities in the chain. In the far right corner, we happen to know that there are a few organizations that are starting to get into this concept of introducing blockchain into artisanal small scale gold mine transactions, but it's not there yet. So there are, as you would imagine, some sensitivities. So if I were to monitor my transactions somehow in my life online, I don't know. I could see myself getting into trouble in one way or another, but it's the stakes are much higher when it comes to a transaction where there might be people exploiting certain people along the chain. The miners might be exploited. So the idea of having these transactions, one thing that the breakout group might do, and in fact, this is the first, you see the one, this is the first breakout group that we thought we would have, or an option for if people wanted to join this one. We'll get to that in a second. But the idea would be is that you might talk about some of those sensitivities and how to navigate those sensitivities, maybe with information technologies that are out there. We happen to know that that a lot of the miners have access to mobile devices or smartphone devices. They may not share their devices, but we would imagine that they might have access. So they might get back to a place where they can say, this is where I was mining, or this was the transaction that was done. And it's those transactions that's really this first breakout category challenge. So the second one, the second one has to do with geospatial data. So for at the beginning of the supply chain, we're not quite sure how to track where all the gold is specifically. That sounds sort of obscure, but we do know where people are making a living on artisanal small-scale gold mining, and we can find sort of the scars on the landscape. And if you were to fly a helicopter over a lot of places, you might be able to see them. But we don't know where the potential is necessarily. We have a rough idea. There are multiple types of geospatial data that can be involved in small-scale gold mining. It might be that you have a large-scale, very granular geologic map. You've probably seen them for your own, for where you live. You might know that you live on top of sandy loam or clay, but that's very granular. It might be to really figure out that you have a good source of gold. You have to have a geologic survey done by experts in the field for a number of days. And then on the other hand, we know that certain people are mining these certain areas, and perhaps nomadically. So in the picture on the far right, this is in Southeast Asia. This is sort of a small scale operation, and that sort of thing might move and it might change location. So one of the other challenges we thought, number two, where we'd like to get folks talking about this, is since we lack comprehensive geospatial information, on activity and potential for gold. We also don't overlay that necessarily with ecological data and the risks to environment. We thought there's an opportunity here for, and again, this would be a culturally sensitive thing, to try to figure out how to map where the gold mining is taking place. So one of the big reasons for this, and that's sort of at the beginning of that supply chain, one of the big reasons for this is that if we know where the potential is, combined with tracing, maybe through blockchain or otherwise, the gold supply chain and the interactions, it might be that people along that gold supply chain have better access to finance mechanisms. Once they have access to that finance, because the financier knows that there's gold in the area, they have a record of the transactions, and maybe there's less anonymity and more transparency on it, we know that they can get financing to upgrade their mechanisms. So instead of using mercury, maybe they can use a different mechanism that's more environmentally friendly, shake pans, believe it or not, or maybe they can take a little bit of a loss because they're tracking all this through time, and so their end product is worth more. So this is one of the other big parts of this gold supply chain topic. And so we're hoping, and Glenn is going to come up next, and he's going to explain the development finance. The two challenges under that one, yes, they're kind of disparate. The development finance is a little different than the gold supply chain. We just happen to be fortunate enough to work on a diverse range of projects. So that was the second breakout group, and I think Glenn, you're next.
All right, thanks a lot, Rick. Again, my name is Glenn Harrington. I am with EPA's Office of International Affairs, and we're gonna go through the next round of issues that we see in our day-to-day work, and that's in development finance. So, of course, development finance, investments by multilateral development banks like the World Bank, African Development Bank, et cetera, play a key role in developing infrastructure and energy resources. And these things are largely beneficial, but through our work, we've seen that there can be a lot of environmental issues associated with some of these large-scale investments by international finance institutions. So the amount of money being dealt out is massive. Every year there's thousands of projects that are proposed. Billions of dollars. This here is just a map showing a little dated from 2010, showing where development finance is occurring. Generally in the developing world, in countries where they often lack the capacity to properly assess and mitigate environmental risks. So a lot of this will be, inherently left up to the lending institutions themselves, or the folks on the ground that are dealing with these problems. So one of the things that we do, and I do on a day-to-day basis, is reviewing these multilateral development bank projects before they come to board to assess environmental risks. And that's not unique to the US government. There are a lot of the other larger donors, like UK, some of the Nordic countries, Canada, also have offices which review these projects for environmental risks before they go to the board to decide how to vote on a project, whether to support, abstain, or oppose a project. And it's not only governments. There are also NGOs that are heavily engaged in this area that are working with the banks to try to improve their processes. And of course, there are the people themselves who are ultimately going to be affected by these projects, whether that's in a positive or negative way. And what we have found is that although these different entities are reviewing in some way or another these projects, either before they're implemented or they're affected by the project, there's not a lot of communication amongst governments, between governments and NGOs, and between governments, NGOs, and the people that are affected by these projects. And that to us sort of presented an opportunity. It's kind of crazy that in the year 2018, we don't really have a mechanism through which we can communicate about all of these projects, those actors being governments, NGOs, project affected people. We just kind of saw an opportunity for information exchange. If there was some type of centralized database where folks could communicate about issues on projects, kind of understand where projects are occurring, that could go a long way in making these projects better. There are oftentimes a lot of opportunities that we see environmentally where we can improve a project, but in order to have the most leverage to do that, we need to kind of form coalitions and gain momentum around it. And having sort of a central database where folks can communicate about these issues would perhaps go a long way in achieving that. So again, this will be one of the breakout groups if folks want to talk about it. All right. So the other issue related to development finance is more so about project selection. Development finance is occurring in, of course, a number of sectors. You have, transportation infrastructure like roads, sometimes capacity building initiatives, and one of the major sectors that we see a lot of investment in is energy. I believe, I don't have the exact statistic, but I think it's something on the order of 15% of development assistance projects go towards energy projects. And we have found through our work that a lot of these projects, when in the environmental and social impact assessments, which they submit, there'll be an alternatives analysis, which they list alternatives to the project. And say, for instance, you have a hydropower dam that's being planned. In the alternatives analysis, it will simply list other places along the river that you could install a hydropower dam. They won't really typically do a thorough, comprehensive analysis of what other types of energy are viable in this country, in this area, what might be the future prices of, say, you're putting in hydro, what are the future prices of hydro or natural gas or solar, how will that investment through time, what will be the result of that investment, and what are the other opportunities that you have as a country for your energy. So we just, despite the fact that these are massive, millions and millions of dollar investments, we haven't seen that type of analysis, which is frankly, kind of troubling. So we thought it would be a good idea to have sort of kind of a central a database analysis of where are certain types of energy most viable. What are the future prices of solar or natural gas, although that's hard to predict. And just all these other factors, and kind of having that available for countries that may lack the capacity to do a thorough analysis, just to have something that they could draw on in the future and make educated decisions about what the best source of energy is for their country. All right. So now, I guess, should we take a few questions if anyone has any? Yeah. So I guess we're gonna go out into breakout groups in just a second, but to kind of discuss some of these issues. Again, we kind of here on the screen, we have mapped out the 4 issues, 2 within gold supply chain and 2 within development finance. Gold supply chain being the tracking of the supply chain, and then of course like the geospatial mapping that would complement that. And then in development finance, the information exchange mechanism between governments, NGOs, project affected people, and the project's alternative analysis. So what we've done, and we have sheets here to help guide you, and that last slide is on the sheet, but we have a list of questions to help guide the discussion. Maybe you want to use these questions, maybe you just kind of want to have a free-flowing discussion, which is totally fine. But the idea is to have folks kind of break out into groups for about 25 minutes or so, 30 minutes, and kind of go through, we want to learn from you. We don't know the answers to these things. We have some ideas, but we want to hear your ideas. I mean, have you heard of comparable challenges? What would be the biggest obstacles? Do you know anybody that's working on these issues or something that's kind of synonymous with this? So again, the idea is to break out in the groups, discuss for about 30 or so minutes. Rick and I will go around and try to help guide the discussion if need be. And then at the end, we'll kind of have just a group discussion to go over what we've talked about. So I guess before we do that, do we have any questions on kind of the issues themselves? Okay. Yeah.
Does everybody get this? Does everybody understand what's about to happen? We're going to break out. You can pick a topic, probably just one topic. Introduce yourselves in your groups. You know, we'll have a sort of a sign up sheet where you might put your email down and your contact information, and then we'd really like to to have you talk about these topics. We'll reconvene and we'll have maybe, you know how normally in these breakout groups you have like somebody who does the report out. Maybe have somebody who takes the mic, does the report out. This is what we thought was important. This is what we thought was not important. I don't know. And we'll have an open discussion. Folks online, if there are folks online, what we'd like to see them do is you're going to operate as your own independent one-person breakout group, which is good. And we'll put the questions back up on the screen so that you might use that as a guide if you're online and you want to, you want to go through the questions. So how are we going to break them up?
Maybe just show of hands over as much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess just to break you guys up, maybe we'll just do a show of hands, and if you're interested, we'll just announce the different topics. And if you're interested, raise your hand, and maybe just go to kind of a corner of the room. So topic 1 on gold supply chain, tracking the gold supply chain. Is anybody interested in? Excellent. Folks that have their hands raised, would you mind, I guess, going to that corner of the room over there? They're all kind of right here. Yeah, maybe just kind of stay right here. Perfect. So we have group 1 right there. Group 2, the geospatial mapping of artisanal and small scale gold mining. If no one wants to do that, that's totally fine. We can skip that. All right. 3, information exchange on development finance. Excellent. Looks like that kind of back corner of the room over there. So again, that back corner will be number 3. Back left. Yeah. And then topic number 4, the alternatives analysis for energy projects and development finance. Anybody interested in that? Looks like we have 2 groups.
No, but I get the idea.
All right, guys, we're just gonna bring this thing back to order for just a few minutes. We only have about 5 or so minutes left, but I guess we're just gonna take this time to kind of hear from each group to give, I guess, a brief summary of what was discussed and you know, some of the answers to the discussion questions that we posed. Would anyone like to volunteer to go first? All right, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start. Hi, I'm Ben Tregenna, Unit WCMC. It's the World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And I was in the group talking about Challenge 1, which was the gold supply chain. Can you track the supply of gold from small-scale miners out to the final market? And can you use that tracking to enforce better behaviour, environmental and health, on everybody in that chain? So we started off talking about whether there were any other situations we'd seen that were similar to that. And surprisingly, we found a few. We talked about the certifiable timber trade. Also, trade in endangered species has a very similar, long, complicated value chain, and it's something that we work with at the centre. And we also talked about small-scale agricultural certification, with our small-scale agricultural certification expert in the group. We also came on then to talk briefly about satellite identification of sites and whether through Earth observation you can tell not just where sites are, but also what their management processes are, whether they're using mercury, which was one of the key dangers that's been identified there. And I think the conclusion was probably not, without a lot of on-the-ground verification, and that's very dangerous in these sites that we're working with. So that led us down a slight sidetrack of well, if the gold's hard to track, can we track the mercury? If that's the root of the real problem. But unfortunately, that sounds about as difficult as the gold problem was. And finally, we had some discussion about how we get the financial trickle down through this long, complex value chain, whilst maintaining anonymity or pseudonymity throughout the whole process. And it was also pointed out that as you bring people at the bottom of the supply chain into sort of the legal or documented economy, that also can erode their potential benefits by bringing them into the taxation system and more official paperwork. I think that's all I've got written down. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Charlotte, would you mind coming up and sharing your findings with the group?
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlotte. I work at Publish What You Fund. We do sort of aid transparency work. So our group, I'm going to try and do justice to all the good ideas we had. So do feel free to jump in and correct me, my group, if I get anything wrong. So basically, we were looking at how to track and understand and sort of get a hold of and allow citizen engagement for big environmental projects that were happening, being funded by development finance, essentially. So in our group, we had a certain amount of experience in that. We had a fellow from Tanzania who had experienced a problem where there had been a big energy project alongside a large body of fresh water, and there was really no way for the citizenry to understand if that fresh water was now contaminated with heavy metals, and there's concern that it's seeping into the groundwater supply. And so far, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of ability to harness information on whether that's actually happening or not, which is pretty concerning. At Publish What You Fund, we do a lot of work with tracking aid financing and posting to the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which has been relatively successful in tracking traditional development aid, less so in tracking multilateral development aid, which is pretty interesting and sort of something that I think clearly, based on this question, that we should really start to look at finding out. So any sort of existing information technologies and approaches that might be altered or scaled to tackle this challenge. We thought of, it was proposed tons of really interesting tech solutions. Specifically, there were really interesting ones called a Conscious Me and I Auditor, as well as Fulcrum, all three of which are sort of tech solutions or apps or software that two of the latter two, the I Auditor and Fulcrum, look at construction sites, and you can tell, it will tell you, I think, essentially, it uses photography and sort of GPS data to see if, they're following the rules, what's actually going on. How is my time up? That was so quick. Sorry. I know. Sorry. There were some interesting solutions that might be looked at. So, like technology, there's also domestic participation by domestic groups on the ground. All the countries will have their own environmental NGOs on the ground. Sort of stronger participation with those could be a solution, as well as further investment in national statistics offices. And we also have some interesting next steps, like potentially microfinance incentives for the citizenry to report back, as well as instituting contractual obligations with the development finance institutions. So instituting obligations for their implementing agencies to put, say if you want this contract, you have to have a certain amount of transparency with the citizenry of what you're doing and allow a certain amount of feedback. And that is a very quick section of what I wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Well, without further ado, it's time to wrap this up. But before I do that, I just wanted to see, was there anything online? Were there any folks online? If you're online and you're listening and you did not get your voice heard, it will be heard. If you email me or Glenn, we're both at the top of this. So if for some reason you're out there and you want your ideas heard, please send them to us, because right now I don't think, can you want to check that iPad and see if there's anything on there? Maybe not. So thanks everybody. If you want to follow up in more depth on any of these topics with us, you can. Our email addresses are at the top, and you can follow up. We'd be welcome to build alliances and partnerships to tackle this stuff, and we appreciate everybody's participation. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody.